Prostitution. My mother always used to call it the oldest profession in the book. I never really knew what book she was talking about, but it was clear to me that this book and its mention of prostitution as the oldest profession was personal to her. She wasn't one to talk about her past, but when I pried, she finally said, "Harmony, I did what all kids who find themselves on the streets of Vegas have to do. I survived." One day I asked her if I could share her story. "If you need to," was all she said. And you know what? I need to. I need to tell the story of a teenage runaway who some might have called a child prostitute. Today, we know enough to know that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, only children who fall victim to commercial sexual exploitation, trafficked and purchased by adults. When my mother finally left that life of trauma behind, unfortunately, the trauma never left her. She parented me the best she could, but she still found herself stuck in her own broken places. And so the pattern continued. Abused and ultimately abandoned, I did what I had to do. I survived. And each night at the strip club, I gave a piece of myself away until there was nothing left to give. No more me, just a shell of a person turned into a product. And I need to tell our stories for the sake of the runaways and throwaways and girls like us, for kids in foster care and those trapped in poverty and abuse, not knowing where their next meal or backhand will come from. I have faced the trauma of my past head on, and I have fought for my recovery. I stand here today, alive and well, healthy and whole, yet bearing the weight of the grim reality that not all of us made it. One of the biggest myths about prostitution is that everyone involved is there by choice. Sadly, this is untrue. Prostitution and trafficking are inextricably connected. 70% of female trafficking victims, according to research, are trafficked into the commercial sex industry. They're trafficked into prostitution, as well as other legal forms of it, including stripping, porn, and legal brothels. There are more women in the commercial sex industry today than any other time in history, a reality that is fueled largely by demand. The demand does what it promises. It demands supply. And when there are not enough people who are willing to sell their bodies for sex, supply will be created by any means necessary. Everything from kidnapping and torture, beating and drugging, manipulation, coercion, trickery. Research shows that 84% of women in prostitution are under third-party control, under the control of pimps and traffickers. In other words, 84% of women in prostitution are selling their bodies without complete agency. Right now, everywhere in the U.S. except for a few counties in Nevada, prostitution remains illegal. It is illegal to sell sex, it's illegal to purchase sex, and pimping and pandering, which essentially means to profit from or facilitate prostitution, are also illegal. And you know what? I think we've got 2 out of 3 of those right. I believe that purchasing sex as well as pimping and pandering should remain illegal. In fact, research shows that when buyers and traffickers are brought to justice, demand is effectively reduced. And that's a good thing because at the end of the day, this is a supply and demand issue. If there were no demand, there would be no supply. There would be no need for people to be exploited and trafficked. So yes, keep purchasing sex, pimping, and pandering illegal. But I would like to suggest that selling sex should not be criminalized because people should not be criminalized for their own exploitation. Right now, the focus is in the wrong place. Ironically, prostituted people are disproportionately arrested, and meanwhile, buyers and traffickers often go untouched. In fact, according to a special agent who was a manager with the FBI's human trafficking unit, you are more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to be arrested as a trafficker. We need to flip this whole thing on its head, arrest the buyers and the pimps and the traffickers, but instead of sending prostituted people to jail, provide them with pathways to freedom and recovery. Research shows that 89% of women in prostitution want to escape, but they just don't see any other options for survival. They don't need handcuffs and jail cells. What they need are options, opportunities to survive without having to sell their bodies. Another myth about prostitution is that it's just a job. Maybe most of you don't see it this way, but there's a huge push to get you to think otherwise, that it's all just consenting adults doing whatever they want with their own bodies. And it's this narrative that has led to a growing movement to normalize and legitimize prostitution through full decriminalization. The idea being to remove all criminal penalties for everyone involved: buying sex, selling sex, pimping, and pandering. As a survivor of exploitation and someone who has founded an organization that has spent nearly 2 decades providing services and support for those who are wishing to escape prostitution and the commercial sex industry at large, this idea is extremely personal to me. And I recognize that many people have been compelled to enter prostitution to put a roof over their heads or to put food on the table for their children. And my goal is not to judge that. In fact, my dream is to see systemic change to where prostitution is not a person's only viable option for survival. I dream of seeing the kind of change that would allow those vulnerable to prostitution opportunities to pursue their dreams and goals and passions and to live thriving lives. Decriminalization will not achieve this. And those vocalizing their support for full decriminalization range from everyone from politicians to celebrities to pro-sex work organizations to the World Health Organization. But they do not represent the exploited and trafficked, because the exploited and trafficked do not tend to speak up as loudly or as often. Their voices are not being heard in this discussion, and they need to be. Those vocalizing their support for full decriminalization do not represent the 89% of people who want to escape prostitution but don't see any other options for survival. The level of violence that people in prostitution are subjected to is truly unfathomable. In fact, women in prostitution have actually been called the most raped class of people in the history of our planet, with 80% having been raped at least once and 73% having been raped more than 5 times. In any other workplace, this level of sexual harassment would be subject to legal action. But for people in prostitution, sexual harassment is a job requirement. When I was working in strip clubs, a legal and regulated form of the commercial sex industry, I was sexually assaulted on a number of occasions. And I finally started standing up for myself and fighting back. In fact, I became notorious for taking off my stiletto and beating my perpetrator in the head. And on a couple of occasions, the police were called on me. And as I stood there half naked in the middle of the strip club trying to explain to the police that I was the victim, that I had been sexually assaulted, and that I was acting in self-defense, they looked at me like I was crazy. "This is your job. Why are you wasting our time with this?" was the subtext of our interaction. In fact, they told me that if I didn't apologize to the person that had just sexually assaulted me, that I would be facing mutual battery charges. The fact that stripping was legal didn't protect me from assault and violence, nor did it bring justice to my perpetrators. And on top of all of this, the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder that we see among prostituted people are equivalent to combat war veterans. If prostitution were just a job, we wouldn't see trauma responses at this level. We've already talked about the deep connection between prostitution and sex trafficking. Decriminalization will not reduce trafficking. In fact, according to one study that looked at prostitution in 150 countries, it was found that on average, in countries where prostitution was legalized, it led to greater inflows of human trafficking. And here's why. Wherever prostitution is legalized or decriminalized, demand for commercial sex skyrockets, which gives pimps and traffickers greater incentive to push people into the marketplace to sell. Whether a person is trafficked into prostitution or would say that they're there by choice, the most vulnerable in our society are the most susceptible. The reality is the majority of people in prostitution are not people who, feeling empowered by a plethora of employment opportunities, decide that selling their bodies is their most desirable career option. No child that I know of dreams of growing up to be a prostitute one day. In the US, on average, 20% of women in the general population have experienced childhood sexual abuse. For people in prostitution, that number is at least 3 times that, with some studies showing rates of childhood sexual abuse among prostitute people being as high as 95%. This is not a coincidence. Obviously, not everyone who has been sexually abused as a child enters into prostitution, but the majority of people in prostitution share this history. Childhood sexual abuse can normalize the experience of being sexualized and objectified. I know that was the case for me. Being sexualized and objectified are also job requirements of the commercial sex industry. The other thing is that childhood sexual abuse leaves many of us with this profound sense of powerlessness over our own bodies. And one of the lures of the commercial sex industry is this idea that we can then take back control of our sexuality and use it to our advantage. I know for me, it didn't take long for me to realize that the person in the transaction with the power was the one with the money, not me. Essentially, prostitution capitalizes off of people's poverty, trauma, and sexual abuse. This is why some survivors have called it the choice made by those who have no choice. And that really begs the question, what is choice without options? Ultimately, it's not a system of empowerment, but one that exploits those with the least power. The question is, what do we do about it? Full decriminalization would remove all criminal penalties for everyone involved, including pimps, which is why it's sometimes called the Pimp Protection Act or the pro-pimping law. Essentially, prostitution would be completely unregulated, and pimping and trafficking would be free to run rampant. Shockingly, this is the model that is being proposed in many states throughout the US. But there is a better way. There is a way to reduce trafficking and exploitation while providing people in prostitution pathways to freedom and recovery. The solution is the equality model, sometimes referred to as the abolition model. In this model, purchasing sex as well as pimping and pandering would remain illegal. But selling sex would be decriminalized because, again, people should not be criminalized for their own exploitation. But it's not enough to simply remove all of the criminal penalties involved with prostitution, because if buyers and traffickers are brought to justice and demand is effectively reduced, then people who depend on prostitution for their survival will suffer the economic consequences of reduced demand. So as a part of the equality model, comprehensive, trauma-informed programs that provide people with opportunities to build a life and career outside of prostitution are established and supported. Because prostitution is not just a job. It is an unfathomably profitable system of violence that exploits the most vulnerable in our society. So let's stop calling it the oldest profession in the book and start calling it for what it is, the oldest oppression in the book. You and I can do something about this. We can use our voice and our vote to help people see the reality about prostitution, to oppose full decriminalization, and to support laws and practices that will lead to recovery and freedom for people in prostitution. My dream is to see a day when our children do not have to grow up in a world where sexual abuse, violence, and exploitation run rampant. I dream of a day when we have such a deep revelation of the intrinsic worth of every human being that the idea of renting out bodies for the sexual gratification of another person is preposterous to us. Because I believe that every person on the planet is worth more than the violence, degradation, and dehumanization that prostitution has to offer. Together, I believe we can achieve this.